being recorded.
Good afternoon. Let's give everyone a moment to join and get sound connected. I see a lot of photos.
Hello.
And a voice or two. Only a couple
here
of.
too. I wasn't ready to be on camera today.
Understood. Adjusting to Zoom conferences. Thanks everybody for joining. Maybe just to hear everyone's voice, if you could put in the chat something that you're interested to learn about, what brought you to this session, just as a way to get us warmed up, and then we'll start in just a moment. It's a little bit of a test to see, can everyone see the chat or is it just me? Dr. Wilkinson just put good day in the chat. Was everyone able to see that?
I can, I'm typing. I'm just slow.
No worries. Strategies to move further along the continuum. Fantastic. Embrace of the notion of a continuum implicit in that statement. Great. And maybe we'll keep populating the chat and let's get started. So I would love to begin with a quick introduction and would love to share a little bit about who we are and then share the equity continuum, appreciate any feedback, and then do an exercise, some reflection, some pair share, and then come back together for a large group discussion. So I'll start with an introduction. My name is John Newsome with Public Equity Group. We're a boutique consulting firm focused on strategy and business planning with an equity lens. I'm joined by my colleague Igor Rubinov, who's off camera, but is driving the slides. We are not joined by our colleague Rita Louh, whom we adore, who grew up just outside of Philly and unfortunately is ill, but she sends her regards and she would much rather be with us. So let's advance a slide. So I want to give you a roadmap of where we're headed. I want to say a little bit about us and then dive into the equity continuum and then do that reflection exercise and a pair share before having a bit of a discussion. There'll be a little space for questions along the way, so we will pause when we get there. And I'm just going to look at the chat again and see some of the hopes that folks lifted up. Beginning implementation of a new strategic plan that centers racial equity. Fantastic, congratulations. Determine where I am on the continuum and how to move along. Listen, learn, apply for self and organization. Great. So Igor, let's move ahead to the next page. Just wanted to give you a little bit of context for who we are. I mentioned that we're a small firm focused on strategy and equity. We have had the pleasure of working with folks like the San Francisco Foundation, Greater Milwaukee Foundation. You'll hear a little bit about those two in a moment, but also RWJ. We've done a lot of work in Puerto Rico with Open Society Foundation grantees focused in civil society. We list CF Leads in particular, network of community foundations. A lot of our work is place-based. And so we were excited when invited to present today. And thanks for wanting to learn a little bit more about the work that we do. Happy to field questions later on. From here, want to dive into the equity continuum itself. So let's move ahead a couple of slides. So we developed the equity continuum based on, first, a framework developed by our colleagues at the Bridgespan Group. Many of us at PEG came out of Bridgespan, and we borrowed from this framework, which we've modified a bit as a part of the backbone of the equity continuum. This is a framework we use for strategic planning, where we begin by identifying the need or opportunity for whatever organization's work that drives a vision and mission, intended impacts, theory of change, ideally. Those then are supported by programs, organizations, and economics, and to measure progress all along the way, we have metrics and milestones. And so when we embark on a strategy process, looking at the left-hand side of the slide, we first want to understand where the organization is today, and then against all the dimensions in the middle, we develop a plan for where the organization
is being recorded.
Where the organization might go next and how the organization might get there. So this is the framework that undergirds our strategic planning process and would encourage using it as a way to think about strategy and business planning generally. So that's the first framework that's important for us to share. If we move to the next page, what we've done, you'll notice, is take the things in the middle of the diagram and put them on the left-hand side as organization dimensions. And so when we think about equity, we think about equity along those same dimensions. I'll add that we have lifted up governance and culture more pointedly because those seem especially important when thinking about equity. They're also important when thinking about strategy. So that's the left-hand side of the equity continuum. And along the top, this reflects our point of view about how organizations seemingly raise questions about equity or approach equity. So the top columns aren't based on theory. Some folks talk about going from less equitable to more equitable, or from, these are actually the questions that when we look back on our portfolio, that clients are typically asking us when they want to engage in equity planning. And we put those questions on a continuum. So very often folks start out by asking how they can do better by clients or participants or grantees. And they'll cite data that suggests that there are significant disparities in terms of health outcomes or education outcomes, and they want to close gaps. And so for many organizations, that's the starting point on an equity journey. For other organizations, the starting point is a recognition that equity must become a higher priority. It's often informed by an understanding of participants or clients or grantees, but often goes beyond that. And so that is often a presenting question. We want an equity strategy for this part of our work or for another part of our work. And then there's a third set of organizations who either are making a deeper transition into a holistic equity commitment or started from that vantage point. So I'll give examples across this continuum. We've done a lot of work in Nebraska. We've had clients who say, you know, the outcomes for Latinx folk in Nebraska are terrifying, as they are for Black folk. And we want to see more progress on those dimensions. And so we've done a lot of work in that regard. There are organizations that will say, like a youth development organization that runs nationally, they've been looking at disparity data. They're recognizing they need to have more dedicated programs for youth of color. They need to hire staff of color to run those programs, et cetera. And so they've made equity a top priority. It's not a singular priority, but it's one of their top priorities. We have a client in Northern California that serves Native American youth. Their starting point is that they're here to advance the needs of Native youth because of the culture of the community, the priorities, and all of their work is through an equity lens, through a Native cultural lens, and that shows up in their mission statement all the way through the culture. So that's a little bit about how we design the equity continuum. And the question that we've been asking our clients and encouraging folks to ask themselves is where the organization is today, where you think it should be and why, what it would take to get from here to there. And to answer that question, many people wonder, where should we start our equity work? And so on the next page, I'll share a little bit of a point of view on where to start equity work that's different from what you may have heard elsewhere. So if we move to the next page, one of the things we often hear is that equity work should start internally, that organizations should be really clear before they go and engage community. And there are many people who have written this. We have examples of clients who've done that. There are other folks who believe really strongly that equity work has to start by engaging with and listening to community. Because we've seen examples of both, our point of view is that equity work can start internally or externally. We also believe that equity work can start on any one of or multiple dimensions on the left-hand side. And that ultimately equity work is iterative. So it starts on one dimension. Let's say it starts with programming, but then it raises questions about staffing, which then raise questions about governance. And so that circular iteration hopefully leads to look at the far right, work that improves internal practices that then drive focus on external, that drive external outcomes, and around and around. Let's move to one or two more slides before we pause for some questions. we thought it might be helpful to lift up a few examples from organizations that have gone on what we think are really interesting equity journeys. So the San Francisco Foundation in about 2014-15 developed a strategy that anchors racial equity, starting with looking at data and across the Bay Area that evidenced just how disparate outcomes were for folks on the basis of race, also geography. And so they centered a strategy that focuses people, certain places and communities, and the importance of power building so that communities can advocate for political change that best benefits those communities. So their theory of change now anchors racial equity. They've also anchored racial equity in their programmatic work. And we lifted up the example of their housing strategy, where because they're a community foundation, they can use unique tools. And so in their effort to protect, preserve, and produce housing, they, shortly after passage of their strategy, advocated for, did research against, and then ultimately, with partners and thanks to the electorate, helped secure passage of a major ballot initiative in one of the counties in the Bay Area. That resulted in a $500 million investment in housing to the tune of about 10,000 units. It was a significant investment, and it really stemmed from their commitment to equity, but also to a rigorous strategy that was rooted in the numbers and what it would take to get to more equitable housing distribution around the Bay. Lastly, in their equity focus, they also have focused on their investment strategy. So not only investing through PRIs and MRIs, but also investing with minority fund managers and even attempting to innovate around social justice funds that center racial equity. So these are a range of tools that they are now deploying as they make equity more and more a priority in their work. I'll share one last example from our friends at the Milwaukee Foundation, and then I'll pause for questions, thoughts, etc. Greater Milwaukee Foundation strategy now looks a lot like the San Francisco Foundation strategy in its breadth. It includes a shift in theory of change, centering programs in neighborhoods, in communities of color. Milwaukee, you may know, is the most segregated city in America. So looking at ways to build wealth, resources, capacity in diverse communities across Milwaukee. Also a focus on early childhood education, one of the areas where there's significant disparity. But they've really interestingly used their assets to help with economic development. So they are moving their headquarters to a new development project, which will anchor one of those many neighborhoods, will serve as an economic development hub. The developer is a local Milwaukeean who is of color. And they're using their endowment to underwrite some of this. So not only, many of you I'm sure have headquarters that are rooted in community, they're using not just the headquarters, but their corpus as part of the investment community, and then helping to build the wealth, the assets of other developers who can go on to benefit Milwaukee more broadly. So with that, I want to pause here. Let's move ahead to one more slide and see if you have any questions about the equity continuum, the dimensions, examples, because from here, I want to give you some time to reflect on these dimensions, and then spend some time with a partner, and then come back as a large group and talk about what it takes to make progress against equity within your organization or an organization. So pausing here, thoughts, questions. You can also put them in the chat. I will consult the chat. I'll pose a question. How does this land? To what extent have you seen organizations for whom, and let's say philanthropic organizations in the Philadelphia area for whom equity is their purpose and focus? And some for whom that's the case, but went on a journey to get there. To what extent have you seen organizations who are somewhere else on the journey, but trying to make strides? Would love just some reflections.
I mean, I'm happy to share. This is Mindy Aldridge. I'm with the Nelson Foundation. And we, as I mentioned in the chat, have a new strategic plan that I think is in the far right. So to fulfill our mission, equity is and must be a purpose and our focus. And we had been interested in staff and board moving that direction. And what I would say is that we really, after the spring and summer of our racial reckoning, where we really wanted to come out and say something, and our board really said, we cannot say something unless we're ready to do something. And then we really had a series of conversations, including work with a consultant before the strategic plan about what did that mean to us. And I guess the benefit of listening to some other conversations where we just felt we would it's so easy to get derailed if equity isn't your focus. So we really looked at it as it's the hub and not a spoke. And if equity was a spoke, we were concerned that we would get distracted. So we're still in the beginning stages. I look over at your organizational dimensions, and we do have a new vision and mission. We are going to launch our new core grant program, but we have so much to do. We've been working a little bit on governance, but as you say, I think it is very iterative. That's been our experience.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing highlights from that journey, and wish you the best of luck and support and partnership. Some dimensions are harder than others. Some are hard at certain points in time. Certainly a journey.
It's interesting. I mean, we knew it was going to be hard. And I think, when we think about culture and, we are fortunate that we're an independent private foundation, and our board is nearly all people of color, but our staff, our mighty staff of 2, are 2 white women. So, that's all of that we have to kind of think about over the intermediate and long term.
Great, thank you.
This is Dr. Zuling Wilkinson. I was writing a little note in the chat, but I'm really intrigued by the language of continuity in equity rather than a one stopgap approach. So when you think about this, do you also consider it in a couple of ways? Number one, communities that generally receive help from some larger philanthropic groups, are they ever engaged in thinking with philanthropic groups about how they move into a more equitable continuum? That's something. The second thing that I've been thinking about today for our agency is, as an agency led by a person of color serving people of color in a large urban area of Philadelphia, what kind of equity approaches do we do internally? Because equity impacts people in many different dimensions, as you have described and as others have described. So it's not a we, they all the time. It's also a we.
Thank you for bringing that nuance to the conversation. So on your first point about community group involvement, we've had clients suggest adding columns to the continuum. One column to the left of to fulfill our mission, we must do better, because there are organizations who aren't yet saying that. Mm-hmm. And then a column to the right where we talk about deconstructing philanthropy altogether, decolonizing philanthropy. Should there be separate organizations that give money to community? How do we make those lines less porous? And then I think we're talking about everything in between. I'm hopeful that as people ask questions about how best to meet the needs of community. They're doing that in conversation with community. That also is maybe leading to a rethink of who's on staff, who's on board. So absolutely optimistic that as folks deepen their thinking around equity, it also leads to a deepening thought around power and position. But this framework doesn't capture that well. So that's a good reminder that there's a 3.0 version that maybe does better. And then I really appreciate you lifting up the point that there's some version of this that applies to organizations that are led by folks of color, that are rooted in communities of color. The questions may be different. Some of the questions aren't that different. So it's a great point. We struggle with this. We're a Black-led firm that centers equity. How do we source talent in a way that doesn't reproduce some of the power differentials and racial biases, class biases, gender biases that pervade our society? And we're of this society, so in some ways we're all subject to it.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? There was let me find my way back to the chat, because there was a really helpful observation in the chat. Seems like equity is our purpose and focus describes only a small number of funders in the region, but more seem to be working on making it a top priority. That's true in our experience around the country. All right, why don't we pause here and create a little bit of space for some reflection, and then some time for some sharing with a colleague before coming back as a large group. So we'll take it as a given that we'll play with the continuum, appreciate feedback on it, but let's assume it's good enough to think about our organization through that lens. If we advance one more slide, what we'd like for you to do is spend a couple of minutes reflecting on your own about your organization's alignment with the continuum. First, if you had to plot your organization, or an organization, if you choose not to use your own, on a column, where would you plot your organization and why? And the second ask is more granular, looking to the organization dimensions on the left. If you chose just 2 of those dimensions, likewise, where would you plot your organization and why? So let's take a couple minutes to think about where, if we had to, recognizing that we're often in many different places on different dimensions, but if we had to choose in general a column, where would we plot? And then choose just a couple dimensions. And then we will move into a partner share. Right, and assuming that you've had a little bit of time to think about where your organization is, would ask you in the partner share to introduce yourselves, and let's agree to confidentiality, and also share what you feel comfortable sharing, and don't share more than you feel comfortable sharing, but ask you to take turns, about 5 minutes each, sharing where you think your organization is on the continuum and why, and those 2 dimensions. And then reflect on what you've shared, what steps you might take or your organization might consider going forward. And so if we advance the slide one more, I think these questions will show up. Yes. And then we're going to invite you to go into small groups. We'd love any, oh, I'm getting an echo. Is there a way to, okay, it's mitigated. Welcome back. We'd love any observations in the chat about how it was to go through this exercise. And then we're going to pull the questions back up and would love to have a bit of a group discussion about them. So I'll impose upon Igor to return us to the slides. Thank you, Igor. And the questions we'd love to explore today is, where has your organization advanced equity and where have you faced challenges and why? So thinking about how you located yourselves on the continuum, both in terms of the columns and then key dimensions, but also start to think about what steps you might consider taking to advance equity. So those are the questions that we'd love to explore together. And for reference sake, we wanted to go back to the continuum so that we have that in front of us and we can think together about those dimensions. So we're going to go back a couple pages. Yes. And is there anyone who would be willing to share? And maybe, again, for the sake of this conversation, let's keep this conversation inside of this Zoom room. And by the same token, share only what you feel comfortable sharing in this Zoom room, which let's agree to have be as safe a space as we can make it. With those caveats, any reflections on the equity journey, successes and challenges faced? You can also anonymize and say, I know an organization who ...
Mm-hmm.
I can share one challenge. I'm Valerie Kind-Rubin with the Patricia Kind Family Foundation. And we're a foundation that funds in Philadelphia around issues of poverty. And I would say that the vast majority of our work is for within communities of color. But I think a struggle that we have to kind of come to grips with is that we are an all-white board, all family. And so I think that is going to put a roadblock for us with how far to the right we move on this, and kind of getting support of the board to make changes with that. I think as the managing trustee is going to be one of my challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. And I wonder, does anyone have suggestions or benchmarks? This kind of harkens back to the question Dr. Z asked about when and how philanthropic organizations work with community. You know, there are foundations that, even family foundations, that involve community members in advisory roles, even in governance roles over time. But know that that takes time.
And I think, we do get a lot of community feedback, and we've done community conversations and that kind of thing. But I've heard mixed views on advisory boards. One, that advisory boards are a good way to get community voice and to bridge some of that gap. And then the other view of, it's really unfair to put people in a role of serving and consulting and not giving them the power to vote. So I can see it both ways.
So thank you for that. I saw Renee raised a hand.
Hi, Renee Smith, chair of the board of directors at Independence Public Media. And we're a foundation that's Philadelphia based, and we focus on media. And we used to be a broadcast organization. We have the benefit of being new. So not a new organization, but new in the role of philanthropy. So we don't have to move a lot from old ways to new ways. And we also have the benefit of having had equity be a bit more centered in our world in our past life. But my question for Kind is, have you done some exploring with regard to delegating grant making decisions and some of those exercises where you're involving more community and doing extreme radical delegation? And if you have, how has that felt?
We have not yet had grantees and community members vote on on proposals. And that is something that we could consider, forming a grants committee. I think it's about getting the support of the board on this. And I think there's a mixed feel. And even when we had community conversations with community members, there was even a mixed take of feedback from them as to, some that said, the reality is you are a family foundation and we value that. And it's different than working with other kinds of foundations. And there's no reason to change that. And others that thought there should be more voice. So I don't think we know where we're headed with this. I mean, I have my own bias, but I'm just one person on the board.
And there might be ways you can start small, or try a little something, or under the guise of exploration and learning.
Yeah.
But there is other colleagues probably here that are more knowledgeable. But for us, the exploration has been very, very valuable, because we've just committed certain pieces with some structure and had a lot of acceptance around the size of the exploration, and that's been super.
Yeah, I see Chanel's hand. I want to add, though, we were intentional about linking this conversation to mission, and so to what extent can how effective is any current board and leadership at addressing advancing the mission, and what would the most effective board and leadership be for advancing the mission? It's another filter on who's at the table and why. But Chanel, want to tag you, and then Dr. Z again.
Thank you. I just wanted to kind of reflect on Valerie's comment and kind of like where you go. And I think a healthy exploration and really looking at the mission, looking at the values of the organization and see where there's alignment and there's not alignment. And in terms of potentially power sharing, what does that mean for the organization? Do we value it? I think it really goes down to a question of values, and also if there's any interrogation of the current grantee portfolio to see if there's diversity, if there's alignment in that as well. And acknowledging that bylaws may have to be changed. Like, there's a lot of implications if that is the route the organization chooses to go versus a grants committee or an advisory committee. Like, do you really want to transform the organizational culture and thinking, or just the grant making, just because there's a lot of things that make up a foundation, not just the grant making as well.
Great suggestions. Thank you, Chanel.
Thanks, Chanel.
Dr. Z.
Let me get can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Valerie. This is Reverend Z from Chester. And we've known each other a little bit down through the years.
Yeah.
I think that what we've been hearing today is that this is also a condition of mindset, that we really have to be intentional in our desire to strive for equity. And that's a paradigm shift for us, a paradigm shift for our society, for our culture, and actually for all of us. Many of us are of the years when integration was about the best we could hope for, and not even equity. We found that integration may have opened doors for some people, that picture on the left, but it still left so much out for other people. So to change a paradigm, I don't believe will be quick, but in fact, it needs to be deliberate and intentional. So if foundations could even find a way to bring people on the board who are perhaps recipients, but not recipients of the funds that you would be distributing to the community. There may be voices in the community at varying levels that your board and your staff might be able to hear from and be helped as the agency or the organization or the philanthropy tries to move consciously toward an equitable alignment.
Thanks for that, Reverend Z. And to your point, as you engage with community, probably some of those community members will ask questions like, well, why aren't some of us in leadership? Why aren't we on your board? And that's probably a good conversation. That's probably the right conversation. And that's why equity is a journey. We acknowledge that in the continuum. There's no arrival point. There's no woke. We're never done. We should continue to ask hard questions as we go. So we are coming up on time. Just wanted to share a couple of things. We are launching a digital toolkit based on the Equity Continuum. We've been writing case studies. We've been curating resources. We're trying to pull the best of what we can find and make it available. So we will gladly follow up and let you know when that is ready. We welcome the chance to follow up if you'd like. So we can put our emails in the chat, Igor and I. Feel free to be in touch. Would love to know how you're doing and what's working, what's not, and also what we can do to improve what we make public. Oh, thank you, Igor. Any parting thoughts or questions? We're coming right up on the hour.
Thanks, John and Igor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting.
Much
Thank
appreciated.
you.
Thanks for the work, and look forward to seeing you in Philly next time.